The forest was silent, except for the crunch of boots on frozen earth. 3 U.S. Air Force security personnel moved through the darkness of Rendlesham Forest, their flashlights cutting narrow beams into the night. Something had fallen here. Something that didn't belong.
This is Tom, and you're listening to Unexplained History. What you're about to hear isn't a story we've invented. It's a story told by United States Air Force officers, documented in an official memo, and investigated by the British Ministry of Defense. And yet, nearly 45 years later, it remains unsolved.
December 26, 1980. The forests of Suffolk, England, a landscape of pine and birch that stretches for miles, surrounding 2 former RAF bases now operated by the United States Air Force, RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwaters. In the early hours of this winter morning, a security patrol would encounter something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, and spark one of the most debated UFO incidents in history.
We're going to walk through this incident, step by step. The witnesses, the evidence, the explanations that have been offered, and the questions that still remain. By the end, you'll understand why this case has earned its nickname, Britain's Roswell.
To understand why this incident matters, you need to understand where it happened. The forest in question lies in Suffolk, a county in eastern England, about 100 miles northeast of London. It's gently rolling countryside, farmland and woodland, the kind of place where nothing much happens, and that's precisely what made it strange.
But in the early 1980s, this quiet corner of England was anything but ordinary. 2 major Royal Air Force bases, Woodbridge and Bentwaters, occupied the area. These weren't British bases anymore. Since the early 1950s, they had been taken over by the United States Air Force as part of the NATO alliance.
At its peak, RAF Bentwaters housed the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing, flying A-10 Warthog attack aircraft designed to kill Soviet tanks in the event of a Warsaw Pact invasion. RAF Woodbridge served as a secondary base providing support. Together, they represented a significant American military presence in Cold War Britain.
Now, here's something that doesn't get discussed enough. These bases stored nuclear weapons. I'm not speculating. It's been confirmed. Forward-based tactical nuclear weapons ready to be loaded onto aircraft if World War III ever came. That context matters.
The tension was palpable. The Cold War was in its final tense decade. The USSR had troops in Afghanistan. NATO was on high alert. American military installations in England weren't just bases. They were forward positions in a potential nuclear exchange. And that made them very, very secret.
When you have a major USAF base surrounded by farmland, you get a certain type of environment. High security, restricted areas, personnel trained to observe, report, and investigate. These weren't civilians claiming to have seen lights in the sky. These were security guards, officers, deputy base commanders, people whose job it was to know what was happening on their installations.
The village of Rendlesham itself sits just outside the forest's edge. A handful of houses, a church, a pub. The forest itself is public land now managed by the Forestry Commission. But in 1980, large sections bordered the airbase perimeter. The east gate of RAF Woodbridge opened directly onto the forest track where the incident would occur.
This matters because the witnesses weren't random locals. They were American military personnel on a secure base, investigating lights observed on their own perimeter. Their reports went up the chain of command. There is an official memo. There are multiple witness statements. This isn't a campfire story. It's a military incident report. That's what makes it so compelling.
The events of December 1980 unfolded over 2 main nights, though some witnesses reported additional sightings in the days that followed. The first night, Christmas night into the early hours of December 26, began with a call to the security desk at RAF Bentwaters.
Let me set the scene. It's just after 3 a.m. The duty officer at Central Security Control receives a call from a patrol near the east gate of RAF Woodbridge. They're reporting strange lights in the forest, descending lights, heading toward the ground. The assumption is that a plane has gone down.
A quick reaction team was dispatched. The patrol, comprising Airman First Class John Burrows, Airman Ed Cabansag, and their shift commander, Lieutenant Fred Burren, made their way into the forest toward the light source. What they found would become the subject of intense debate for decades.
Now, the most extraordinary account comes from Sergeant Jim Penniston. He was the first to reach the object. What he described, what he experienced, that's what we need to focus on.
Penniston moved forward alone. The rest of the team hung back, their flashlights trained on his silhouette as he approached the tree line. Each step crunched through frozen undergrowth, twigs snapping beneath his boots, breath clouding in the cold air. The light ahead grew brighter, brighter than any flashlight, brighter than any lantern. It had a color he couldn't name, a shifting hue that seemed to come from the object itself.
And here's where the story gets strange. Really strange.
The object materialized through the trees like a mirage becoming real. 10 feet across, 8 feet high, triangular, metallic, but not like any metal Penniston had seen. Smooth as polished glass, black as the space between stars. 3 legs extended beneath it, retracted slightly into the ground as if the craft had settled there like a bird coming to rest. Colored lights pulsed along its edges, soft at first, then brighter, sinking to some rhythm he couldn't hear.
Can you imagine that? Standing in a dark forest, face to face with something that shouldn't exist.
Penniston raised his flashlight. The beam reflected off that black glass surface, and that's when he saw the symbols, etched into the metal, hieroglyphic, angular. They seemed to shift slightly as he watched, though he couldn't tell if that was the light playing tricks or something else. He reached out, his hand trembled, not from fear exactly, but from something deeper, something he couldn't explain.
There's a detail here that complicates things. A moment of hesitation. He knew he shouldn't touch it. Every training instinct told him to step back. But curiosity is a powerful thing.
His fingertips met the surface. It was warm. Not hot, warm, like living skin. For a moment, nothing happened. The lights continued their pulse. The forest remained silent. Then
something changed.
A beam of light erupted from the craft, not outward but inward, enveloping Penniston entirely. The world went white. Somewhere behind him, the other airmen shouted. Radio crackled. But Penniston couldn't hear them. Couldn't hear anything except a tone, a frequency that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his mind. A sequence, ones and zeros, binary code, flowing into him like water into a vessel.
He would later write those numbers down. 27 years later, he'd reveal what he says came to him in that moment. But We'll get to that.
When the light faded, Penniston stumbled backward. The craft, his hand still burning where he'd touched it, rose silently. The three legs retracted into its belly. It hovered for a moment above the canopy, brilliant beams shining down on the frozen soldiers below. Then it accelerated, gone, vanished into the night sky like it had never been there at all.
But here's where things get really interesting. The witnesses experienced something strange afterward.
Burrows looked at his watch. 3:30 a.m. That couldn't be right. They had entered the forest only minutes earlier, at 3 a.m., maybe a little after. But the time on his watch suggested they'd been standing there for nearly half an hour. An hour, perhaps. Time had slipped.
Radio chatter erupted. Other airmen checking their watches, exchanging confused looks. Some said they'd been standing in the same spot the entire time, watching Penniston approach, watching the craft, watching it leave. But the clock said otherwise. 45 minutes had passed, maybe more.
They couldn't account for it. They still can't. The witnesses experienced what researchers call missing time, a phenomenon where someone loses track of time, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, with no memory of what happened in between.
And here's the part that gets me. When they came to, they were back in the forest, some distance from where they'd been standing. They couldn't account for the time. They couldn't account for the space. Something had happened to them, something they couldn't explain.
The forest went silent again. No wind, no animals, just the quiet hum of whatever had just left.
That's one version of events. There are multiple witnesses, and their accounts don't perfectly align. But there's another account from this same night. A second group of airmen, moving through a different part of the forest, also encountered strange lights. They saw the craft rise, shine lights on them, and ascend rapidly into the sky. Whatever happened in Rendlesham Forest that night, it wasn't over.
Let's be clear about who these witnesses were. This wasn't a group of credulous civilians. These were career military professionals, airmen, sergeants, a lieutenant. Their livelihoods depended on their credibility, and yet the details they provide are remarkably consistent in some respects and notably divergent in others.
The most detailed account, of course, comes from Sergeant Jim Penniston. His description of a metallic, triangular craft with strange markings has become one of the defining images of this incident.
But there's another witness whose account carries significant weight. Lieutenant Colonel Charles I, Holt. He was the deputy base commander at RAF Woodbridge, a senior officer whose word carried institutional authority. Holt didn't witness the initial event, but he was about to become part of the story.
2 nights after the initial incident, on December 28th, Holt led a team back into the forest to investigate. He took a radiation detector with him.
The reading he got near the supposed landing site was slightly elevated above normal background radiation. Very slightly. But it was there, and he documented it.
But here's what's fascinating. Some of the men, when questioned later, acknowledged something important. At the time, they initially thought they might be looking at a lighthouse, the Orfordness Lighthouse, visible from that area. That detail matters. It shows these witnesses weren't locked into a UFO interpretation from the start.
John Burrows, one of the original patrol members, told investigators that after seeing the lights, they initially thought they were chasing a beacon, something like a lighthouse or a radio beacon. When they realized the object wasn't what they thought, that's when the situation became more confusing, more unsettling.
These witnesses didn't start with a conclusion and work backward. They started with a routine call, thought it was a downed aircraft, and found themselves confronting something they couldn't explain. Their confusion is part of what makes this case compelling.
In the days following the incident, the story didn't stay contained within the base. Local police were called to the scene in the early morning hours of December 26th. Their report, interestingly, described seeing only distant lights, which they attributed to the Orfordness Lighthouse. They didn't see what the airman had seen.
The police arrived about an hour after the initial call. Whatever had been in the forest was gone by then. They were looking at the horizon, not the tree line.
But 2 nights later, something extraordinary happened. Lieutenant Colonel Holt and his team were in the forest when the lights returned.
This is the moment that haunts me, honestly. Listen to what happened.
Holt assembled his team in the early hours of December 28th. A handful of airmen, a radiation detector, and one other piece of equipment, a portable cassette recorder. They entered the forest through the east gate of RAF Woodbridge, flashlights cutting through the darkness.
The radiation detector clicked softly as they walked. Small clicks, then slightly louder. Holt noted the reading, slightly elevated, not much, but more than background.
Then the lights appeared.
Holt lifted the cassette recorder and pressed the red record button. The tape began to spin.
3 o'clock hours. His voice said quietly into the microphone. We're in the forest now. There's a light. It's moving.
What happened next was captured on that tape. You can hear it. The wonder in his voice, the difficulty in describing what he's seeing.
Lights in the sky, not static, not blinking, moving, splitting apart. One moment a single point of light, then 2, then 3, dancing across the darkness over RAF Woodbridge. They hovered. They changed direction. They moved with what Holt called intelligence.
Then one of the airmen suddenly spoke. "Sir, it's coming toward the base."
The lights were moving toward the installation, toward the runway, the buildings, the weapons storage area. Holt's voice on the tape catches the tension. It's heading toward the Bent Waters side. It's hovering now, over the airfield.
A deputy base commander standing in a forest at 3 a.m., using the word intelligent to describe lights in the sky. And now those lights are heading toward the base, toward potentially sensitive areas. That's not someone looking for aliens. That's someone describing what he sees.
The team watched for nearly an hour. Another group, separate from Holt's, reported seeing a red light dancing inside what they described as eerily pulsating fog. Smaller lights darted between the trees. The radiation detector registered its readings. The cassette tape spun.
That audio, the Holt tape, along with the memo he later wrote to the Ministry of Defense, forms the backbone of the documentary evidence.
The investigation proceeded through military channels. The base commander was briefed. A memo was prepared, and eventually the British Ministry of Defence was notified. But here's the crucial point. The MOD treated this as a low-priority matter.
Their position was that the incident didn't appear to pose a threat to national security. It wasn't investigated as a matter of defense. It was filed away. And for years, that might have been the end of it. But the witnesses talked. They told their families. Families told others. And eventually, the story leaked out of the military and into the public sphere.
The Halt memo wasn't released publicly until the late 1980s. When it emerged, through a Freedom of Information request, it created a sensation. A sitting deputy base commander, a man with no apparent motive for hoax or fabrication, describing lights, a metallic object, elevated radiation readings. It was the documentation the UFO community had been looking for.
The physical evidence, what little there was, showed triangular indentations in the ground. Vegetation appeared disturbed. The radiation readings were taken with professional equipment. Skeptics would say those indentations were rabbit diggings, the radiation natural fluctuation. But someone measured, someone documented. That counts for something.
For several years after December 1980, the Rendlesham incident remained a relatively obscure story, known primarily within UFO research circles, discussed in specialized journals and at conferences. That began to change in the mid-1980s, and by the end of the decade, it had become one of the most famous UFO cases in the world.
The first major turning point was the release of the Halt memo. Up until that point, the story had been based on witness accounts that had grown in detail over the years. But the memo was a primary source, a contemporaneous document written by a senior officer describing what he'd seen and measured.
Dated January 13, 1981, just 2 weeks after the incident, the memo described the events of December 28, the strange lights, the radiation readings, the marks in the ground. It was addressed to the Ministry of Defence and marked secret. When it finally surfaced publicly, it was partially redacted, but the essential content was visible.
Then came 2010. That's when Jim Penniston made public something he'd kept private for nearly 30 years.
After touching the craft that night in 1980, Penniston had written something in his notebook. Numbers. Rows and rows of ones and zeros. He didn't tell anyone, not his superiors, not the researchers, not even his family. For nearly 3 decades, the numbers sat quietly in a notebook, a secret he carried alone.
Why keep it secret? He never fully explained. Maybe he thought no one would believe him. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe over time, he convinced himself he'd imagined it. We'll never know.
But in 2010, Penniston finally shared the numbers. Researchers took them, not independent analysts, but enthusiasts, began decoding. What they found was extraordinary.
Geographic coordinates pointing to ancient sites around the world. The pyramids at Giza, the Nazca lines in Peru, and something else, a location mapped as High Brazil, a mythical island in Atlantic folklore that appears on medieval maps but doesn't exist.
But there was more. The decoded text included something referred to as the origin year 8100, a date far in the future, and a warning about humanity's future, something about evolution being mandatory for survival, about a choice that must be made.
And this is where the story becomes difficult. This is one of the most extraordinary claims in the entire case, and it requires enormous skepticism. The binary codes weren't revealed until 2010, 30 years after the incident. The decoding was done by researchers with a vested interest in finding something extraordinary. There's no independent verification. It could be confabulation, a story that grew in Penniston's memory over decades. Or it could be something more. We have to hold both possibilities.
The media had a field day. Documentaries, television shows like Unsolved Mysteries, countless magazine articles. It became a touchstone for the UFO research community. A case with credible witnesses, physical evidence, official documentation, and a mysterious message. It was, as one publication put it, the best documented UFO incident in British history.
Today, you can walk the UFO trail in Rendlesham Forest. There are tours, annual events, books, films. It's become part of the local identity, tourism driven by a mystery that refuses to die.
Here's something worth considering. Most UFO sightings disappear within weeks. Witnesses move on, memories fade, the story dies. So why is Rendlesham different? Why has this case persisted for nearly half a century?
I think about this a lot, and I think there are a few reasons.
First, the witnesses. These weren't anonymous callers or blurry photos from civilians. These were career military professionals, people trained to observe, report, and document. Their livelihoods depended on credibility, and they've maintained their stories for decades.
Second, the documentation. There's an official memo from a deputy base commander. There's an audio recording. There's a paper trail that goes through military channels. It's not just stories, it's evidence.
Third, the physical site. You can visit Rendlesham Forest. You can walk the UFO trail. You can stand where the witnesses stood. It's not abstract. It exists in the real world.
Fourth, the mystery deepens over time. The binary codes in 2010. The leaked Condine report in 2015. New witnesses coming forward. New theories emerging. Each decade adds a layer, not closure.
And fifth, the timing. This happened at the height of the Cold War, at a military base with nuclear weapons, involving American service personnel. The geopolitical context gives it weight that a sighting in a rural field simply wouldn't have.
Most UFO sightings are easy to dismiss. Misidentified planets, weather balloons, hoaxes. But Rendlesham has layers. It has witnesses who won't back down. It has documents. It has a physical location. And it has a mystery that keeps growing. That's why it won't die.
Let's step back and ask the obvious question. What does mainstream science make of all this? Are there terrestrial phenomena that could explain what the witnesses saw?
The first explanation skeptics reach for is surprisingly simple.
The Orfordness Lighthouse. It's about 5 miles from the site, and on a clear night, its pulsing beam can be seen from the forest. Atmospheric distortion could make that light appear to move, hover, split apart.
The lighthouse. But here's what's interesting. Several witnesses, including Holt, knew the lighthouse was there. They're experienced observers. They specifically identified lights behaving in ways a lighthouse couldn't explain.
So what else? There was a fireball, a bright meteor observed over southern England on the night of December 26, 1980. It was seen by hundreds of people. These are relatively common but dramatic events. A rock from space burning up in the atmosphere, appearing suddenly, lasting only seconds.
If witnesses saw this fireball and then investigated the forest, they might have connected two unrelated events. It's possible, but it doesn't explain the physical evidence, the landing marks, the radiation readings.
The claim about binary codes, that's extraordinary from a scientific perspective. There's no known mechanism for telepathic transmission of ones and zeros. It's not replicable. It exists only in the witness's account, decades after the event.
But there's one more explanation worth considering. In 2015, a classified British Ministry of Defence document known as the Condign Report was leaked. It suggested the Rendlesham Forest incident could be explained by plasma phenomena, balloons of ionized gas that can appear suddenly, move intelligently, and produce lights and effects witnesses described.
The Condign Report proposed that certain atmospheric phenomena, not well understood in 1980, could account for many UFO sightings. It wasn't published, it was leaked, and its conclusions are debated. But it shows how seriously officialdom sometimes took these reports internally, even while publicly dismissing them.
Here's the honest assessment. Every element of this case can be explained by known phenomena: the lighthouse, the meteor, misidentification, atmospheric effects, hoax. But none of those explanations account for everything. There's a residue of the unexplained that remains. That's what keeps people arguing. That's what makes it a mystery.
The Rendlesham Forest incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a broader pattern of UFO sightings near military installations, particularly American military installations, during the Cold War.
The most famous example is Roswell, 1947. A UFO crashed in the New Mexico desert. The U.S. military recovered the craft and bodies. A cover-up ensued. At least, that's the story. Like Rendlesham, Roswell involves military witnesses, official documents, and a narrative that refuses to die. That's why they call Rendlesham Britain's Roswell.
But there are other cases. In 1976, a similar incident occurred at RAF Lakenheath, just a few miles from Rendlesham. Witnesses reported a craft with running lights. One claimed to have seen a figure next to the object. The case was investigated by the British Ministry of Defence and remains officially unexplained.
The Phoenix Lights, 1997. Thousands of people in Arizona witnessed a massive V-shaped formation of lights moving silently over the city. The military said flares. People aren't so sure. And in 2004 and again in 2014, U.S. Navy pilots off the coast of California encountered objects with flight characteristics impossible for any known aircraft.
What's consistent across these cases isn't the details. The objects vary in shape, size, behavior. It's the type of witness: military personnel, trained observers, pilots, security guards, radar operators. These aren't people you'd expect to misinterpret a lighthouse or a meteor.
Could the Rendlesham object have been secret military technology, an early prototype, test flown near a restricted area? That would explain the military interest and the secrecy. but witnesses described a craft that hovered, landed, and took off vertically. No known aircraft from that era could do that.
The binary code transmission, if it happened, defies any conventional explanation. It's an intriguing hypothesis, but it doesn't fully account for the evidence. What these related cases tell us is that Rendlesham isn't unique. It's part of a pattern, a recurring phenomenon that appears in different forms, in different places, over decades.
Whether that phenomenon is extraterrestrial, secret technology, atmospheric plasma, or something else entirely, that's the question we're trying to answer.
In recent years, the conversation around UFO sightings has shifted dramatically. What was once dismissed as crank territory is now being taken seriously at the highest levels of government.
The Pentagon has officially acknowledged the existence of what it now calls unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP. Not aliens necessarily, but phenomena that can't be identified. Aircraft that move in ways that defy known physics.
Congressional hearings have been held. Military pilots have testified under oath about encounters with objects that had no visible propulsion, that could accelerate faster than any known aircraft, that could dive and climb in ways that would crush a human pilot.
Declassified documents have been released. Programs like the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATIP, have been revealed. The government is officially studying these phenomena, even if it won't say what they're finding.
Where does Rendlesham fit into this? Some researchers cite it as evidence that the phenomenon is real, that military witnesses have been seeing these objects for decades, and only now is the world catching up. Others say it's a historical curiosity, a case study in how mysteries propagate.
What I find interesting is the timing. The UAP conversation has moved from fringe to mainstream precisely because cases like Rendlesham wouldn't go away. Enough witnesses, enough documentation, enough people asking questions. Eventually, the institutions had to respond.
Let's bring together the various explanations. There are multiple theories, each with supporters and critics.
First, misidentification. Lights in the dark, lighthouse, meteor, stars, brains trying to make sense of them. Under stress, in an unfamiliar environment, it's easy to see shapes that aren't there.
Second, secret military technology. An experimental aircraft, prototype stealth drone, test flown in restricted airspace. The witnesses saw something they weren't supposed to see. Official silence is evidence of a cover-up.
Third, plasma phenomena. The Condeen Report explanation. Atmospheric phenomenon. Ball of ionized gas. Poorly understood, misidentified. The radiation readings could be coincidental or natural variation.
Fourth, extraterrestrial. A craft of non-human origin. The binary codes a message from another civilization. Official silence, a global conspiracy to hide the truth. This has captured the public imagination, but it requires the most extraordinary assumptions.
Fifth, time travel, an extension of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. The message talked about the origin year 8100. If it came from the future, the craft might be a time machine. It's a fringe theory, but some researchers advocate for it.
Sixth, hoax. A former US security policeman claimed responsibility, said he used a modified police vehicle to create strange lights as a prank, but there's no evidence this happened on the specific nights of December 26 or 28, 1980.
Each theory has strengths and weaknesses. The misidentification theory is simplest, but doesn't account for all testimony. The secret technology theory is plausible, but contradicts the object's observed capabilities. The plasma theory is scientifically grounded, but speculative. The extraterrestrial theory is sensational, but requires the greatest leap of faith. The hoax theory has never been proven.
Now let's hear what the skeptics have to say, specifically what they find problematic about this case.
The first fundamental problem is lack of independent verification. No radar records, no tracking of an unidentified object on any official system. The police saw nothing unusual. The physical evidence was ambiguous. Triangular marks that could be rabbit holes. Radiation readings that could be natural variation. It's a case built primarily on witness testimony.
There's also the question of human perception. Here's what science tells us. At night, in unfamiliar environments, under stress, human perception becomes unreliable. The brain fills gaps with expectations. Pattern recognition kicks in, sometimes too aggressively. We see faces in clouds, messages in static, shapes in shadows.
And memory makes things worse. Every time we remember something, we reconstruct it. We add details. We lose others. We smooth over inconsistencies. 30 years is a long time. Long enough for a memory to become something quite different from the original experience.
The second issue is the evolution of the story. When witnesses first gave accounts, they were relatively restrained. Lights in the forest, an object that might have been a lighthouse. Over the years, details grew more vivid, more dramatic. Penniston's account of touching the craft and receiving binary codes didn't emerge until 2010. 30 years for memory to distort, for the story to take on a life of its own.
There's also the question of the witness's state of mind. Middle of the night, cold, woken from sleep, investigating what they thought was a plane crash. Under those conditions, perception is unreliable. The brain fills gaps with expectations. The result can be a genuinely felt but objectively inaccurate memory.
The documentary evidence, the Halt memo, is real, but it's a summary written 2 weeks after the event, by a man who wasn't a witness to the initial incident. It describes what Halt found when he visited the forest, not what happened when the airmen first encountered the object. It's evidence of an investigation, not evidence of an alien craft.
Finally, the problem of claims added over time. The binary codes, the decoded message, the contact. Each, if true, would be extraordinary, but none can be independently verified. They're all dependent on the word of a single witness, many years after the event. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that evidence is absent here.
The skeptic's case. Tired, stressed military personnel investigating lights in a dark forest, misinterpreted mundane phenomena. Their memories, shaped by expectation and reinforced by contact with believers, grew more dramatic over time. The documentary evidence is ambiguous. The sensational claims have no independent support.
But the skeptics haven't closed the case. The radiation readings, however small, were taken with professional equipment. The witnesses were trained observers who, at the time, didn't think they were looking at a lighthouse. Some details, some timings, remain difficult to explain away. It's not an open and shut case. That's what makes it so enduring.
Fast forward to today. What is the legacy of the Rendlesham Forest incident? How has it shaped the culture, the conversation, the ongoing debate about unidentified aerial phenomena?
In terms of cultural impact, it's enormous. Dozens of documentaries, from the History Channel to specialized UFO productions. At least one feature film, 2014's The Rendlesham UFO Incident. Countless books, magazine articles, blog posts. Search for UFO incidents in the UK, Rendlesham is almost always at the top of the list.
The forest has become a destination for UFO enthusiasts from around the world. Guided tours, an annual UFO conference, a marked trail with information panels. Local businesses have embraced the phenomenon. It's become part of the regional identity, an economic driver in its own right.
But the modern impact goes beyond tourism. For decades, governments said there was nothing to investigate. UFO sightings were misidentifications or hoaxes, not worthy of serious attention. But cases like Rendlesham, military witnesses, official memos, physical evidence, complicated that narrative.
The British government has maintained there's nothing to disclose. In 2001, the Ministry of Defence released its files, concluding the incident posed no threat to national security. The files are available to the public, but there's no smoking gun, no proof of extraterrestrial contact, just a mystery that persists.
Here's what I think is the most significant modern impact. It changed the conversation. Before Rendlesham, UFO sightings were treated as a joke, crank territory. But here was a case with credible witnesses, documented evidence, official records. It forced people to ask, what if there's something real here? That question, once asked, can't be unanswered. That's the legacy of Rendlesham.
It's late December 1980. A group of American airmen stand in a forest in Suffolk, England. It's cold, it's dark, and they're looking at something that shouldn't be there. A metallic object, triangular, hovering silently among the trees. One of them, Jim Penniston, reaches out and touches it, and in that moment, everything changes.
I've laid out the evidence, the theories, the criticisms, and I want to end by being honest. I don't know what happened in Rendlesham Forest. I don't think anyone does. But I know this. Something happened. The witnesses saw something. They reported it. They documented it. And for 45 years, the story has refused to go away.
The most likely explanation is mundane. Lights misidentified in the dark. Memories distorted by time. A good story that grew better with each telling, but likely isn't the same as certain. There's a residue of the unexplained that remains. There are aspects of this case that don't fit neatly into any box. That's its most enduring quality.
What makes this incident so compelling isn't the answer, it's the question. Trained observers in a secure military location saw something they couldn't explain. The documentation exists. The witnesses have stood by their stories. The mystery has deepened over time. we still don't know.
In the end, that's what unexplained history is all about. Not providing answers, but asking better questions. Not convincing you of a particular theory, but inviting you to sit with the uncertainty. The truth, whatever it is stranger and more complex than any single explanation. And sometimes, the most honest thing we can say is, we don't know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But we're still looking.
Thanks for listening to Unexplained History. I'm Tom, and I'll see you next time.
And somewhere in Rendlesham Forest, the trees still stand where something, whatever it was, once landed.